Honorable Justice Gopala Gowda, sitting judge of the Supreme Court of India, Honorable Dr. Jaipuria, Shri R.M. Malla, Dr. Ashraf Rizvi, those who are delegates to this seminar, members of faculty of the Institute, students, other distinguished members of this distinguished audience. It is indeed a privilege for me that you have invited me to deliver the keynote address of this conference. I thought over the matter and decided to choose a particular theme. The theme I am titling is Ethical Dilemmas in Decision Making, and the focus will be mainly on administration, because that has been my area. But I think some of the things I would say would apply mutatis mutandis to other areas, businesses, other professions, and so on. And when I was thinking as to how to approach this subject, which is relevant to the main theme of the conference, I thought that I should tell a few stories. And the stories would be true stories. And students of management would elevate these stories to what they call case studies. So, to illustrate what kind of ethical dilemmas we face in administration, let me begin by recounting a story which dates back to 1971-72, when, among others, I was one of the officers deputed by Government of India to Bangladesh. Now, this was the year when Bangladesh was facing a war. If you remember the historical background, was that an election was held in Pakistan, in the earlier part of 1971, which was won by Awami League, the party from East Bengal, East Pakistan. And Sheikh Mujibur Rahman was the leader, and automatically, if the result of that election had been honored, he would have become Prime Minister of Pakistan. But this was not acceptable to West Pakistan, which was the dominant area in that country, as it was then constituted. Though East Bengal or East Pakistan had a slightly larger population than West Pakistan. Nevertheless, the dominance was of Pakistan. They enforced Urdu even in Bengal, although Bengalis resented that, and there were many areas of friction between the two parts of Pakistan. So at one stage, when Sheikh Mujibur Rahman was about to become the Prime Minister of Pakistan, it was decided that that would be subverted. And it was subverted, and in fact Sheikh Mujibur Rahman was actually put behind bars, and tremendous atrocities were unleashed through the Pakistan army on the eastern wing of Pakistan. And many people were killed, women were raped. The nature of atrocities perpetrated by West Pakistan army on the East Pakistanis, or then East Pakistanis, was something which is difficult to believe. It was something like the killing fields of Cambodia, that was the kind, or it can be compared even to the Holocaust. Now, in that situation, millions of people came to India as refugees, and there was an exodus of people fleeing from East Pakistan and coming to India. And this was an enormous problem for India, because ultimately about 10 million refugees came to India, and we had to handle them. Now, in that situation, there was, of course, a big movement to oust the Pakistanis from East Bengal, and the movement was led by people from East Pakistan. The Mukti Bahini was constituted, and they were fighting the army, which was, of course, much more better equipped. But ultimately, as you know, India had to intervene along on behalf of the Mukti Bahini, and ultimately on 16th of December 1971, the Pakistani forces surrendered to the Indian forces in Dhaka. Now, at this time, it was thought that some of us, some civil officers, should be deputed to Bangladesh to assist in restoration of administration there, in restoration of order there, and also act as liaison between the authorities and the people and the local administration, the local people of Bangladesh. So I was privileged as one of the officers. Originally, we had been selected to become district magistrates in districts of East Pakistan. But it was later decided that that would mean that India was going and occupying Pakistan. So it was decided we would not be designated as district magistrate, but one officer in each district who had district experience in India was posted there to deal with the local administration, enable them to revive the administration there, and also to act as go-between between the Indian Army authorities and the local people there. So I was posted on 16th of December, as I said, Dhaka, East Pakistan was liberated. I still remember that night I was here somewhere near in a place called Tura. We were waiting to get the news, and we heard Mrs. Indira Gandhi, the Prime Minister of India, speaking over radio and saying that she is happy to say that now Dhaka is the free capital of a free country. And and on 17th, the next day, we crossed the border and I was in Mymensingh, which was where I was posted for 3 months to deal with the situation. Now this was a backdrop, but then the Indian Army, there was a brigade at Mymensingh and I was with them. Now, I gave you this background, but the main story is this, that one day, I mean there are many other aspects which one can go on saying about what happened in those days, but I am now going to relate to you a small episode which will illustrate what kind of dilemmas one is confronted with. I was staying with the Indian Army officers in a so-called mess which they had set up in the agricultural college premises in Mymensingh. And one day, after the day's work was done, early in the evening, along with 2 colonels who were my colleagues and friends, we were taking a walk on the road which was at the periphery of this institute. A little beyond, there was another bungalow, a big bungalow, which was occupied earlier by an UN agency. Now, when we were passing that bungalow, and it was getting dark, maybe 5:30 in the evening, when we were passing that bungalow, we noticed some activity there and saw that a military truck was standing there, and some army people, some Jawans, probably an officer, they were doing something there, which looked a little suspicious. Now, therefore, I requested my 2 friends, the colonels, that we should go and see and check what is going on. And we went there and we found that an army officer, young army officer, I can even share his name now, his name was Captain Nigam. He was standing there directing the others, and this UN building now had, as I said, that the Pakistani forces had launched an all-out attack on the local people there, and as a result, not only the local people, but many others had fled. So this UN building compound had been vacated. The people, the officers, and all the UN personnel there had left the building, and it was just abandoned and there. So these people, this army officer, was in the process of dismantling some of the equipment there. And already 2 of the air conditioners had been dismantled and put into the truck, and another 2 or 3 were in the process of being dismantled and taken away. Now this was a very sad thing. It amounted to plunder of an invading army. And normally one of the most revered institutions in the country is the Indian Army, just as the judiciary is, and we expect the highest levels of integrity from them, and they live by that diktat largely. But in this case, we found that this was happening, and taking advantage of the fact that the compound was abandoned, these people were taking away goods from there. Air conditioners had been dismantled, 2 had been taken out, another 2 or 3 were in the process of being taken out. So I felt very sad, and so did my 2 colleagues, the colonels, and we of course immediately stopped that. And then the dilemma was what should be done, because on the one hand, in fact, my 2 colleagues were saying that we will take care of this and we will make sure he is severely reprimanded and the goods are restored. I felt that if we left it at that, it would mean that we would be condoning something which was not legal and which was also immoral and unethical. And on the other hand, the issue was that if we highlighted the matter, it would the prestige of the Indian Army would be affected. It would be known that some people from the Indian Army were doing such things, plundering goods in a country which we had helped to liberate, and which was of course quite unethical. So the dilemma was whether the matter should be hushed up in the interest of keeping the good name of the army, or should punitive action be taken. Now, my 2 colleagues, the colonels, they were for the former course. They said that we will take care, we will get this officer internally punished, he will not but let this matter not be elevated to a level where it gets publicity. But I found that it was against my conscience to accept this advice. And therefore I said, no, I will not agree. This man has committed theft and he has betrayed a trust. The trust that the people have in India and Indian Army, which has helped them to in this liberation trust. So this cannot be countenanced. And therefore I drew up a report, handed it over to the brigade commander there, the brigadier, and said, please take action. And of course the goods were seized and all that. Ultimately, I am happy to say that a court-martial proceedings were ordered against that army officer. And a few months later, after I had come back to India, and I was posted back to my desk in Delhi, from there I had to go to Imphal, where the court-martial proceedings were being held, and I gave evidence, and later I was informed that the gentleman, Captain Nigam, had been cashed. This message, this news to the patient, or not? Should he do it? If he does, then that patient might go into a depression and not even last 1 year. But if he does not, then maybe he will not take even the treatment that will make him live for a year. And he will become careless, and then without the treatment he will die. So there is a dilemma for the doctor, what he should do. And I suppose the doctor has to give a response depending on what impels him, what his conscience tells him. But these are dilemmas which are not easy to resolve. Now, take in business. In business, you know, the basic aim of business is if we go by neoclassical economics, the basic aim of business is to maximize profits. So, in the pursuit of, and your basic responsibility is to your shareholders. Shareholders will be happy only if you maximize profits and share those profits with your shareholders. But in that process, can you cut corners and be unethical? If we go into some theory, and if we recall Adam Smith's invisible hand, then there is a justification for focusing only on profit making. Because Adam Smith propounded the theory that if every individual who's involved in business takes care of his interests and works hard and maximizes profits, then the invisible hand which guides the market will ensure that the benefit, this entire society is benefited. So then your conscience is clear. If you, so long as you don't breach rules and regulations and laws, you can cut corners and focus on maximizing profits, forget about ethics. The ethics is taken care of because the invisible hand of the market will so ensure that your efforts at maximization profits benefits the entire society. That is the theory. And this also got support from the Protestant ethic theory, which Max Weber enunciated, where again it is said that the duty, it's a religious duty, a moral duty to work hard and make sure that you make profits in your business, and this automatically will help the society, benefit the society. So these are theories, but then how far that is true? Because it was realized that the market is not always so munificent that everybody will benefit just because you are working for profits. It is necessary to be ethical in your business practices. That's why later the concept came that there is need to have corporate social responsibility, or CSR. And corporate social responsibility implies that you not only work to maximize profits, but you also take care of society. For instance, the Jaipuria Group's example has been given that they run textile mills, they run their businesses ethically, but they are doing so much for education. So this is not an obligation. What they are doing for the education is not an obligation for them, but they are doing it out of altruism. And altruism should go hand in hand. If you are ethical, then altruism should go hand in hand with business. But take an example, another hypothetical example. If you are in business, you are running a company, and you are competing with other companies, and there is a big project coming up, 500 crores worth project, which will benefit your company immensely if you can bag it, if you can successfully tender for it. But there is a competitor, and the competitor also is very keen to bag the project, and both of you are going to tender for this. Now, if you are in company A and you know that B, your competitor, is going to tender also, if you can get information as to what their tender price will be, what their quotation will be, you can always make sure that you give a lower tender and get the project. In order to do that, should you have one or two of your friends are working in the other company, and you can subvert them by giving them temptation, saying that you will give them a job in your company at a much higher salary, provided they let you know what their tender is going to be, what their price they are going to quote. Now, is it ethical for you to do that? I think it's certainly not ethical, but it's a big temptation, the end of the road for you. Now, what should you do? Normally, of course, the ethical answer will be that no, you should not subvert an employee. But can you resist that temptation? So these are the kind of dilemmas that you may face in business. Now, I will tell you of another story of my own experience. The story I told you about the army captain was with reference to a situation in the field. Now, we who have been in the civil service, Mr. Vinod Mehrotra also may have had many experiences like this, face situation in the field where you have to take spot decisions and decide whether your conduct is ethical or not on the spot, and you don't have much time when you are dealing with a law and order situation. But when you are in the government of India or the state government and working in the secretariat, it's different. You are examining issues on files and you are taking decisions on files or putting up files to the minister. At the level of joint secretary, deputy secretary, your duty is to analyze a particular matter, give the options fairly, objectively. Now you can, if you have, you can always be tendentious and probably if you're biased, you can analyze the problem and give the options in a manner that the decision should be taken or to favor a particular option which you are in favor of. But if you are objective, then you will give the options you will analyze the problem objectively and give the options also objectively. Sometimes decisions are also taken at the level of joint secretaries, but they are minor decisions. Major decisions go up to secretary and policy decisions, of course, all go up to the minister. Now, here was a case. I will now come to a case. I was then Revenue Secretary in Government of India, and this was the time when you recall the days, Mr. V.P. Singh had become Prime Minister of India, and then his government, the Janata government which he headed, fell when a number of MPs from his party sided with Mr. Chandrasekhar and they defected. And then the government fell and Mr. Chandrasekhar became the Prime Minister and his government was supported by the Congress from outside, Mr. Rajiv Gandhi. This was in 1991. I was then the Revenue Secretary when this happened. And then, of course, this is another story that Mr. Chandrasekhar government also didn't last because very soon Congress withdrew the support, so that government also became lost majority and general elections had to be called, the Lok Sabha was dissolved. So this was that particular, this episode which I am relating is in that period when Mr. Chandrasekhar was Prime Minister and the support had been withdrawn, the Lok Sabha had been dissolved, the elections had been announced, the elections were to be held in June and end of May, June, and elections had been announced. To Chandrasekhar government was in a caretaker status. Caretaker status, the kind of rule or practice is that the caretaker government does not take major policy decisions, but it does the routine business of government. Now this happened and I was the Revenue Secretary. One day I was sitting in my office. The Revenue Secretary has a very heavy load, hundreds of files every day, tax exemptions, mostly relating to tax matters. So one particular file had come to me. I was just sitting and looking through these files when my PS rushed to my room and said, "Sir, there's a file here which I have got a message from the Minister's office that you should see it and clear it immediately." So he pulled out that file out of the file and put it before me. And he was standing there. I said, "Please go away, let me look at it." Then naturally the file had come to me, so my attention had been drawn more carefully. Maybe in a routine manner I would have not scrutinized it, but this time, since the file was brought to me and it was said that the minister wants it cleared immediately, I thought I must see it very carefully. And I did. And I found that this was a proposal. Now this was the month, it was end of April, early May, probably end of April, 1991. Now when I saw the file, it was a file for exemption from custom duty of imports of a large quantity of woolen blankets which were to be imported and by a charitable, so-called charitable organization operating in the states of Punjab and Haryana. And the idea was that the exemption was sought on the ground that this was to be distributed free to the people and therefore the customs duty should be waived. The loss of customs duty was estimated at about 8 to 9 crores, which nowadays seems a very small amount, but in those days it was still a fairly substantial big amount. So I felt a little suspicious because North India summer, month of April, May, you don't need woolen blankets to be distributed to the people in the rural areas. So I felt a little apprehensive about clearing the file right away, although the ostensible purpose shown was charity. I called the concerned officer from the CBEC, Central Board of Excise and Customs, who had handled the file, and he told me, sir, this case had come with a message from the minister's office that the case must be cleared immediately and they are interested. No, as you know, the elections were in the offing, and of course parties collect a lot of funds during elections, so obviously it was that period. So then I recalled also that few years before that there had been another case in which they had India had allowed import free of customs of second-hand garments, lot of second-hand garments, woolen garments, which later had been siphoned and sold in the open market in the streets of Delhi and elsewhere. So that had been a scandal of some sort, and I suspected that this would become another scandal. So I wrote out a note opposing this and saying that this case was not justified. And I thought I had done my job. Now, the file went to the minister, then I was told that by my PS that the minister had called the Minister of State and they were sitting together and wondering what to do with this because they had probably committed that they would waive the customs duty. Then the minister was very capable and he wrote a nice note and overruled me. And he overruled me and said that the customs duty exemption may be granted. He said that the point that the secretary has made is valid. However, I mean, you can always give another ground that this is a charitable purpose and it will subserve the greater good and help the people, and therefore the blankets may be allowed to be imported free of customs duty. Now the file came back to me because files on the way back, there is a rule in the Secretariat that files on the way back must also be seen by Secretary, because Secretary must know what the final decision is and whether it is in consonance with rules and law. So when the file came back to me, now I had done my job in the sense that I had recorded my views and I could have let it go. Because once I have recorded my views, the minister can always overrule the secretary, and I had been overruled. So that was one option, let the matter go, because I had done my job. But somehow that did not satisfy my conscience at that point of time. And they couldn't do much to it. So I decided, then fortunately something came to my aid. Whenever there is a caretaker government and election is announced, this will happen within 1 month from today in respect to the central government also. The cabinet secretary sends out a circular letter to all secretaries saying that you have to make sure that no policy decisions are taken in this period and only routine work of government is done. So that letter has come from the cabinet secretary to me as one of the secretaries, and I took out that letter and I quoted that letter on the file, and I said, in my view, this is a policy decision which should not be taken by this government. And then instead of returning the file to the minister, I got it sealed and got it sent to the cabinet secretary. Now, meanwhile, there have been 3 or 4 queries from the minister's office, what has happened to the file? So I told my PS, just you don't say anything, you just say that secretary is looking into it. And then after the file, I spoke to the cabinet secretary and he said, fine, you send the file to me. And I sent the file to me, and after the file had gone to the cabinet secretary, I told my private secretary to inform the minister's office that the file has gone to the cabinet secretary. This, of course, was not liked by the minister, I believe. Certainly he would not like it. And later the cabinet secretary told me that he had called him up and said, oh, I don't know why the file has gone to you, but you should release the file. But the cabinet secretary was a very seasoned person and he did not release the file. And ultimately the elections were held and the file never came back. So I was able to thwart successfully some designs which, and I think the government, although if we had allowed that thing to happen, the decision would not have been ethical. Episode I thought I must mention. Now I think I'll take a few more minutes. I know you're all very keen to here, Honorable Chief Guest Justice Gowda, but
points are very, very important. Very important.
Thank you,
Experience.
So, but before that, I will now probably not, I have actually a few more stories to tell, but probably I desist from doing that, because I think 2 stories are enough. 2 case studies, if you would like, 2 case studies are enough. But then I must speak something about corruption, because that is inextricably linked to the issue of ethics in decision making. You know, corruption is, and our public services, our officials, they're all subject to, I mean, very few are free from this malaise. Now, when I was reading about corruption, I found that there is, of course, school of thought among Western writers and thinkers who say that the concepts of integrity, honesty, and even democracy, people's participation in democratic life, these are concepts which have evolved with the West. And these have been, we try to impose them on the developing countries, but it is against their ethos. Even the World Bank and the ADB seem to concur with this view, because for every, nowadays there are certain clauses relating to Transparency International, which publishes figures regarding what is more to do with circumstances which prevail in our countries vis-a-vis those countries. Now, Dr. Bimal Jalan, who was previously Governor of Reserve Bank of India, in his book The Future of India, has estimated, on the basis of an Morrow's, the writer called Morrow, economist Morrow's, his econometric model shows that corruption can be reduced by, if corruption can be reduced by 50%, growth, economic growth can go up by 1.5%. Now, on the basis of that model, Dr. Bimal Jalan has developed a model in India, for India, according to which his estimate is that if corruption can be reduced by 50%, economic growth in India could go up by 2%. 2%. For instance, our economic growth has now gone down to the level of 5% and below. So if even half the corruption that prevails in India can be reduced, our economic growth could have been 7%. When we reached 8%, it could have been 10%, because corruption is rampant in India. So this is, I mean, apart from all the other ethical aspects, this is a very practical aspect, that it is impinging on growth. How does it impinge? We take, for instance, because of corruption, you take wrong decisions for location of projects. We must locate, projects should be located optimally after taking into consideration all the factors. And if we fail to locate projects optimally, then losses will occur. This applies more to public sector projects. So this is one way that corruption leads to inefficiency, inefficient working of projects, and ultimately it affects growth. That is, if we take wrong investment decision, it happens. Of course, it has other effects. It affects receipts of our revenues. It affects, it demoralizes people who are working in the projects and so on. Now, I think because this is such an important issue, and the case that I cited was also a case of corruption. So I think before closing, I will read out what I have written on this subject, and possibly it will be of some interest. Some observations on the issue of corruption which would be of interest, I have written down, and with your permission, I'll read it out, and with that I will close. Since the issue of corruption is on everyone's lips these days, I would like to share some thoughts on the subject with you. The public discourse on corruption today generally focuses on nitty-gritties of individual cases. As a result of obsessive fascination, particularly in the electronic media, the big-ticket corruption cases such as sale of 2G spectrum, allocation of coal blocks, Commonwealth Games contracts, and analyzed threadbare. In this din, sometimes the big picture gets obfuscated. Hence, it is worth recalling that Dr. Bimal Jalan, whom I spoke of, underscores the fact that the economic consequences of governmental and private corruption in India is humongous. He has estimated that a reduction of corruption by, say, 50% impacts growth to the extent of 2%. Imagine that if corruption could only be halved, the country's economy would grow by an additional 2% with the attendant benefits of job growth and all-round prosperity. The instances narrated by me, speaking of certain instances like the ones I spoke of, are illustrative of the fact that corruption, even in high places in India, has been endemic since long. Perhaps the government that took office immediately after independence were free from this malaise. But soon afterwards, idealism was replaced by cynicism and probity by greed. The men and women who learned their politics at the feet of Mahatma Gandhi and fought for our freedom belong to a different political culture. Since persons such as Jawaharlal Nehru, Sardar Patel, Dr. Rajendra Prasad, Sarojini Naidu took up official positions for some time till leaders of that generation were in office, corruption was generally confined to the lower echelons of government. This generation of freedom fighters was, however, soon to be replaced by career politicians who did not believe in the same values. Hence, anti-gravitationally, over time, corruption trickled upwards from the lower levels of governmental machinery to the higher echelons. By the 1970s, corruption had become rampant at all levels. The main difference between today and, say, the last 3 decades of the 20th century is that amounts involved have since gone up exponentially. In the 2 instances I have cited, in fact I have written about another instance, one instance was the one I quoted to you. During 80s and 90s, there were a few crores of rupees were involved. The scams of today, such as the sale of 2G spectrum, involved hundreds and even thousands of crores of rupees. And why not? Corruption has to keep pace with inflation. Prices of tomatoes and onions have also gone up manifold. A development that differentiates the present from the past is that certain institutions designed to act as sentinels against corruption, such as the Honorable Supreme Court, Controller and Auditor General, Central Vigilance Commission, and the Central Bureau of Investigation, have perhaps become more proactive than before. Even in the absence of setting up of much debated Lokpal, these institutions have unearthed big scams. Incidentally, their role has come up for much debate too. It has been argued, for instance, that the CNAG has questioned governmental policies which is beyond its remit. Such criticism has even been levelled against the Supreme Court. I have made these observations because the issue of corruption has been the focus of a great deal of attention in the media, and even elections have been won and lost, with this issue being the central focus of political campaigns of parties and individuals. However, it needs to be said that the Aam Aadmi, or common man, who is the focus of campaigns of the political parties, is really not so much concerned with corruption in high places. He or she is singed by corruption that affects day-to-day lives of the people. Hence, more important for the common man is the corruption at the lower levels of bureaucracy, such as graft that is encountered when a person has to obtain a driving license, a ration card, or get permission from the local authorities for a building plan, or pay hafta to a policeman. Eradication of corruption at these lower levels is really more important because it impinges on the concerns of multitudes of people. Such corruption is beyond the reach of CNAG, CVC or CBI. It is unlikely that even an empowered Lokpal can do much to curb it. Mr. Kejriwal will not like this. The reforms have to emanate from within the organization. Values that lead to probity must be given paramount importance and instilled during the educational process in schools and colleges. in training institutes like this by seniors, at the workplace whom the juniors are expected to emulate. All this is easier said than done. However, it must be pointed out that society where corruption is less prevalent than those which score high in development indices. The countries which have less corruption according to Corruption Perception Index of Transparency International are the ones which rank high in Human Development Index, such as Scandinavian countries. In Asia, Japan and Singapore are instances in point. Development, that therefore is the key. That was the point that I wished to drive home. And finally, before closing, I would only like to say that every one of us needs to have some yardstick, some measure by which he or she has to determine whether when you are acting, it is the right, you are making the right choice or not. And what would be the best yardstick? What would be the principle that you should follow? And I think no one has said it better than Mahatma Gandhi, who said that I will give you a talisman. Whenever you are in doubt or when self becomes too much with you, apply the following test. Recall the face of the poorest and the weakest man or woman whom you have seen and ask yourself if the step you contemplate is going to be of any use to him or her. I think that would be the best test of all. And thank you very much indeed. You have heard me with great patience.